everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on WJOPLP New Report at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on New Report Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am so pleased and delighted to welcome today's guest. I've been looking forward to talking with Ellen Lepionka since I was able to book her several weeks ago. Ellen Lepionka is an independent scholar researching the indigenous history of Essex County for a book that she's writing on the subject. She lives on Cape Ann, and she's a retired college instructor and author with a master's degree in anthropology from Boston University. She's also done doctoral work at the University of British Columbia. She taught cultural and physical anthropology at Boston University and also at other post-secondary institutions. Her articles on Essex County archaeology have been published in the Bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society and the Journal of the New England Antiquities Association. Ellen, welcome and thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show today.
Good morning, Mary. Nice to be here.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you here and to learn more from you. So in full transparency, I work seasonally for the trustees at Castle Hill on the Crane Estate. And I had the opportunity to see a video that you provided for some coastal education volunteers there, which absolutely sparked my interest in learning more from you and led me to want to focus our conversation this morning on the indigenous people who live in that part of Essex County. So to begin, Ellen, could you address the very common misconception that Agawam was the name of a Native American people that inhabited Ipswich? What does Agawam really mean, and where was it located, and what language is it?
Well, Agawam is actually the name of a village, and it's located where Wigwam Hill is today, on the Castle Neck River in Ipswich, which is on the Crane Estate. And it was a mobile village because the people had to move their villages periodically in order to grow their corn. You can't keep growing corn in the same place.
Yeah.
You have to have fresh earth to put it in because it depletes the soil of oxygen.
Right.
So the villages were quite mobile. And the people were actually the Pawtucket, or at least that is what the colonial government called them. The local people called them the Agawam Indians after the name of their village. We don't really know what they called themselves.
Interesting.
They were a branch of the Pennacook from New Hampshire, and one ethnographer whose work is widely respected suggested Ninawak, the people
Ninawa.
here, the people,
Okay.
the people here, yeah.
Okay.
Which is very, very common. You find that in the history of other indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere, their name for themselves is really the people. We're the people.
Well, that's kind of how we all think of ourselves,
That's
isn't
right.
it? So that
Yep.
makes perfect sense.
Sometimes it's the real people, or the people in this place, or the people. Yeah.
So just to make sure I understand you, so Agawam was the name for a village that the people called Pawtucket inhabited on it, kind of like, I know exactly where you're talking about, on the backside of Crane Beach, where Wigwam Hill is. But am I understanding you that then the Agawam village would go wherever the people went? So if they were rotating crops, for example, as you're talking about, they would sensibly need to do, rather than deplete the soil, that Agawam village would be wherever they then moved so that they could plant corn anew. Okay, so it
might just be a half a mile this way or that way, or a couple of acres away, or something like that.
But it was a movable farm,
Yes.
so to speak.
They had a very highly mobile society because their economy was very mixed. They were constantly exploiting resources that were available seasonally. And so, as well as, things that are available year round. Their permanent villages were on the coast, which had year-round supplies of food, and then extra resources inland that they would travel to. So had to be very coordinated. It was a very sophisticated economic system, and they didn't all move all en masse, because they were not organized as a tribe. They were organized as bands. And so each family or family band was doing its own thing. And then they would come together for certain purposes, ceremonial and political.
So they were very environmentally alert and aware about the resources that would be available in different places and different bands among them. Some people might relocate to a different area, but there were certain villages along the coast then that were more permanent kind
That's
of
right.
abodes.
Yes.
Because there were, I mean, you can clam year round, presumably. And so, well, that's really interesting. Now, I'm interested in learning a little bit more from you about the word tribe and how that's used, because I remember you saying in the talk I had the opportunity to listen to that, you know, that it wouldn't be accurate to talk about the Pawtucket as a tribe. So what's the distinction between, for example, how would you define what a tribe was and maybe give an example as opposed to, say, bands of itinerant Native Americans?
Right, right. A tribe is a corporate entity. It exists independently of whoever's in it.
Oh,
Whereas a band is a voluntary association and can grow, shrink, or even disappear. So it depends on the people that occupy it. But a tribe is more of a exists, you know, independently of whoever's in it. And bands don't have, for example, chiefs. A tribe is more likely to be a chieftainship or a pre-state type of organization, or a kingdom, even a kingdom. But bands don't have that type of top-down organization. The power is distributed throughout the society through a system of leadership families. So, and the
okay.
families inherit their status. The Sagamores and the Sockums are from families who have inherited a high status and are expected to have an important social role for the whole community, for all the people. They're the stewards, for example, of both their kin group and the land that they're on, the homeland. And they were responsible, for example, for allocating resource areas, like which family got to work which part of the river. For their individual each family's subsistence. And they also paid tribute to each other depending on their rankings. So, for example, Masconomet paid tribute to Nanapashamet and the sons of Nanapashamet until later. And then the Pawtucket paid tribute to Passaconaway in New Hampshire. So there were these shifting alliances based on individuals and individual families.
Well, that's really interesting. As you describe it, the notion of the clan comes to mind, for example, in the Scottish traditions.
Right.
And if I'm understanding you, then these bands, it was sort of an inherited kind of leadership role for the Sagamore.
It was inherited, but they didn't have clans. They had, I guess the word in anthropology would be moieties.
moieties.
Each society, each band included all the people you were related to, and then there were all the people that were eligible for marriage. So
Oh,
yeah, that everybody alive was either a relative of yours or somebody that you could marry.
oh, well, that makes sense, doesn't it?
They practiced.
I mean, it's still true, but
Yeah.
that word, I know I've seen that word. It comes back from you know, my ancient memory of anthropology courses I took as an undergraduate. Moiety, is that Moieties?
Right.
Okay,
Which means
yes, okay,
halves. It means
yeah,
halves.
okay,
The kinship system, the anthropologists referred to as bifurcate merging, which is
okay,
you know, there are certain finite numbers of ways in which human beings organize their
yeah.
kinship systems, and so there's a classification there with variation, but so they were not clans,
Okay.
but for the Pawtucket it was patrilineal. They did reckon their descent through males, and but there were a lot of all the people who were in the leadership families, both male and female, had shared the same high status, and there are many instances where it was females who were running, just like we have kings and queens in England, you know.
Okay,
So,
yes,
yeah. And
yeah.
the female leaders were called Sonksqua. was the name for that, the Sonk Squaw.
Can you spell that?
Saunkqua. Sonk
On
Squaw.
squaw. Oh, oh, thank you for that. It
Yeah,
helps
that
me
is
kind of to
actually
visual.
that's where the colonists got the word squaw
Ah, of
from,
course, that
which
makes
they
sense.
used in the Western European Puritans' view. A squaw was a derogatory
Yeah.
term. You were a mere squaw.
Whereas the reality was it was
Yeah,
an honorific.
that's right. That's right. That's a good way to put it.
Well, this is fascinating, Mary Ellen. One thing I did want to ask you, because the question comes up all the time, because people hear Pawtucket and they immediately think Pawtucket, Rhode Island,
Mhm.
near Providence. And so did the Pawtucket people, as you're talking about them, have any connection to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, to your knowledge?
No,
Okay.
it's the same. It's the same with Agawam. The
The town in
Algonquian,
Western Mass.
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
There are lots of Pawtuckets in east of the Mississippi and all up and down the coast, and there are also other Agawams.
Mhm.
And what happens is that the Algonquian system of naming places was based on the geography. So
Oh,
Pawtucket means at the falls on the tidal river.
okay.
So
All right.
potentially any place that was a waterfall on a tidal river could be called Pawtucket.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And Agawam, could you define Agawam?
Actually, well, Agawam is one of the very few Algonquian place names that has not been confirmed.
Mm,
There seems to be a missing syllable, and it may have been Agawiwam.
okay.
The way it was written in the colonial document is extremely diverse, and it does suggest a missing syllable. But
Oh,
aside from that, it is the closest meaning seems to be on the other side of the marsh, specifically the
okay.
salt marsh,
Okay.
distinguishing salt water from fresh water. So Agawam, Agamen is the word for other side of
Mhm.
it. So
Okay.
yeah. So, for example, Agamenticus is on the other side of the small tidal river.
And outside York, Maine. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
So,
also West Gloucester was called Agamenticus.
oh, wow. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. So that's fascinating because place names then were based on the geographic features of
Right.
where you were. And so, as you're pointing out, those place names could pop up wherever you had
The
that
same
geographic
features.
feature.
Right.
So, okay.
There are a lot of places with NAUM in the place name because NAUM was actually a Massachusetts word referring to fish. And then you have
Okay.
Nahum, Nahum, which is actually Western Abenaki for eels. So you have Namkiag or Nahumkiak. Here are eels for Nahumkiak, which was how it was originally transcribed by the English based on what they heard.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
and then there are
Yeah.
other places, but it's just, here, there are eels here or here are fish. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Oh, that's just fascinating, Mary Ellen. Those place names can show up then, for example, no, anywhere there are eels.
Anywhere where there were Algonquian people doing the naming.
Okay, there you go. All right, those two criteria. Well, you've mentioned Masconomet as a Sagamore among the Pawtucket people, and I did want to ask you more about him because he comes up in the history at what's now known as the Crane Estate, Castle Hill on the Crane Estate. So I was hoping that you could tell us the story of how Masconomet came to approach the Mass Bay Colonists. My understanding is particularly John Winthrop Jr., the son of the first governor of Mass Bay Colony, with negotiating an exchange of money for Agawam, or part of Agawam anyway. So could you tell us the story of how that came to be?
It actually begins when Winthrop Jr.'s father arrives on the Arbella in 1630.
Mm,
And Masconomet had himself canoed out to the Arbella and went on board while it was before they had even made landfall
mm,
to welcome him. They were very interested in having the English with them and nearby because they were at an extreme disadvantage in relation to their native enemies.
Oh,
Their native enemies on the east were the so-called Tarantines, which were the Micmac and the Passamaquoddy and the Maliseet and sometimes the Penobscot even. And then their enemies to the west were the Mohawks or Kahaka. All these names are incorrect, but I hesitate to start pronouncing them all correctly for you.
oh,
But
because we might get lost, but
Passamaquoddy is Peshtamakati, and
okay.
it's Penawapskek instead of Penobscot, so
Okay. So we get all of these
uh,
variants according to what the English ear
that's
heard and
right.
wrote down, and it's not exactly
And
what they
now
would
we're
have said.
finding out what they really were,
Yeah.
totally different. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, those people had guns.
Yeah.
The Micmac and so on, they were in the French fur trade. They were the earliest people to have been contacted by Europeans 100 years before the English set foot on
Mm,
any Western soil, and they had guns, and so did
mm,
the Mohawks from the Dutch. So
mm,
the people in New England, the agriculturalists, they didn't have them. So they were very anxious to have the English as a buffer and as an ally to
yeah.
protect them or to help protect themselves from their enemies. And that's basically how the dispossession of indigenous land began here in
Mm,
Essex County. Um, so Winthrop Jr., well, let me put it this way. uh, the governor had sent his son out to Ipswich for three reasons. One was to make sure that the French were not making incursions down the coast.
okay.
The other was to scout out a place where they might have a plantation, which
Mhm.
eventually becomes Ipswich, and also to evict squatters.
Hmm.
All the English who had arrived prior to 1630 were to be
Oh,
evicted
oh, okay.
because they had bought their land directly from Masconomet and from the Indians, and that was no longer to be. Those sales were now null and void. You had to have permission to buy Indian land from the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Okay.
So it was a huge upheaval, and there were a lot of people who were here prior to 1630, going back to 1620. So you had 10 years worth of people who were doing do-it-yourself stuff in the coves,
Yeah.
setting up their fishing posts or trading posts or whatever, and they were now under pressure to leave, to be kicked out. So those were the main reasons. And he happened to be in the area during a Tarentine attack. But it was
Oh,
both in 1631 and 1632, the Tarentines attacked. And the accounts vary in terms of how many enemy there were and how many canoes they came in.
mm-hmm.
It's like any other history where the
Yeah.
numbers. So 100 canoe, it's either 100 canoes or 100 enemy, came down in
Okay.
either three canoes or whatever. But and they were quite deadly. They were, he lost Masconomet lost 7 or 8 men,
Mm-hmm.
and some of his relatives who were related to Nanapashamet were wounded in the 1632 attack. So the English were warned that the Tarentines were coming, and the English, being Europeans, thought that it had to do with them.
Mm,
They thought that the Indians were coming to, get rid of them, when actually they were simply retaliating against their native enemy.
mm-hmm.
That warfare pattern was based on vengeance, so it went on and on, sometimes for generations.
Mm,
But anyway, he happened to be there, and he and about, I think, there were only 7 or 8 men altogether who were English who had come up from Charlestown to scout the area who were there, and they repelled this Tarentine attack.
oh,
So it's in gratitude for this that Masconomet basically gave land to Winthrop Jr. The land
Okay.
was between Labor and Vane Creek and Tobacco Creek, which was the Ipswich River.
Okay.
So that was the initial grant. It included Castle Hill. That was in 1637.
Mm-hmm.
So then there was the attack the following year, and Masconomet deeded the rest of what became Essex County to John Winthrop Jr. for another 20 pounds sterling in 1638. So there are two deeds. The first, the smaller one, to him personally, and the second, the larger deed to the people who were going to found Ipswich Plantation. So
that's fascinating. So the first deed was actually out of gratitude for the Mass Bay colonists who held off the Tarentines in their raid, this kind of Hatfield and McCoy kind of generation-long feud that they've been having. And so that was an outright gift, if I'm understanding you.
Well, he would not have understood it as a sale, because they did not have the idea that nature could be commodified. It was a completely alien concept. He would have regarded that 20 pounds that Winthrop Jr. paid as tribute, a payment of tribute.
Oh, okay.
So you have a very small number of English at this stage, and a very large number of indigenous people still, because this is prior to the first smallpox epidemic was not until 1633. So that initially you have a huge imbalance in numbers. And it was not clear that they had come to appropriate the place. It wasn't
not
clear.
yet.
Not yet. So and the money would have been seen as the payment of tribute for the right to live there, and the right to fish there, and the right to use the resources there. Usufruct rights, they call it. So it didn't take them long to understand about buying and selling from the market perspective. The thing that confused them was the idea that you could place a monetary value on a tree. Or that you could decide that this stretch of the river was the exclusive personal property of somebody, because a river is a river. How can you own the water that's running? It's like, how can you own the air that you breathe?
Right. Yeah.
Well, everybody depends on the land, so you can't possibly have it be anybody's exclusive area. All of New England was open to all people. The only time you couldn't walk through an area was if you happened to be at war with that group. You were taking a big chance to walk through there. And otherwise, all the indigenous people of New England moved freely throughout the entire Northeast.
Well, thank you so much for explaining that, because I know you had talked in your earlier talk, and I've read other places, of course, that indigenous peoples, they didn't have a concept of ownership of the land. As you say, how can you own a tree? It belongs to itself, it's nature. And yet, the Mass Bay colonists certainly came with the notion of private property. And so thank you for explaining that they saw it as a tribute in exchange for use of the land. But everybody had use of all the land everywhere, because it's our planet. And we all live here. That said, as you point out, you could be taking a risk if you walked on land that somebody else was busy using and they perceived you as a threat. So that go ahead.
I was going to say that was another area of misunderstanding, and that is that the Pawtucket, as agriculturalists, they were not using fertilization or irrigation. And so in order to ensure future harvests, they were constantly preparing land for cultivation, but then not planting it, but keeping it fallow, or building it up after each rainfall to improve the quality of the soil for future planting. The colonists saw this as wasteful. This was land that was being left idle, that had been prepared for cultivation. They just didn't get it. So they thought, they don't have any need for this land. We can take this land, and a lot of the towns, including Newbury and Gloucester and Rowley, they were all begun on, even Concord. was begun on what they called the hoed ground that had been prepared for cultivation, that they would buy from the Indians. And it was, in a sense, surplus land because they weren't planning to plant on it that year or maybe even next year. But at some point, they were expecting to be able to plant on that land and found that they couldn't.
Well, so that's really interesting because the indigenous peoples were way ahead of the Europeans in terms of, basically scientific farming practices, because it's certainly accepted today. You can't just keep depleting the soil.
Yeah.
You won't get the same quality food, or you won't get any food at all, because the nutrients in our food come from the soil. And if there's no nutrients left, your crops either won't grow at all, or they will be, very deficient. So they actually were, way ahead in terms of their own
Well,
science.
the
Go ahead.
colonists did fertilize. They
Uh-huh.
called it manuring.
Mm.
And their idea of what made you a legal owner was if you manured the land. Anybody who
Mm.
manured the land was improving it. And
Mhm.
if you improved the land, then you had a natural right to own that land.
Mm.
So
Okay.
one way to acquire indigenous land was to claim that it had been left abandoned or unimproved and therefore was up for grabs. That was one of the stratagems.
I see. So Native American people might be leaving some ground to lie fallow, which means the land will enrich itself, natural decomposition
Yeah,
will happen, and it will fertilize itself.
yeah.
But from the colonist perspective, if you move in and actively manure the land, and I assume that means literally,
Literally, that's right.
then their perception was that we're improving the land in order to harvest it, to
Therefore,
utilize
we
it.
have a right to it.
So therefore, we have a right to it.
Right.
So it's interesting kind of clash of understandings
Yes.
there.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. Well, you know, I wanted to ask you, Mary Ellen, so this takes us up to a certain point where we talked about the two different deeds taking place at different times. What happened to Masconomet and the Pawtucket people that he was Sagamore of after these deeds were granted to John Winthrop Jr. and the Mass Bay Colonists?
The Pawtucket mostly continued to live on their lands. And the problem came between 1630 and 1640. Upwards of 20,000 people came from Europe to New England, to the New England colonies. So there was this huge influx, and all of those people were land hungry. They were looking for land, and they couldn't get too far inland because of the terrain. It wasn't, so here were all these prepared fields right on the coast, and but the indigenous people were able to stay on their land for the most part. Masconomet lived on Choate Island or Hog Island
Mhm.
for a long
Mhm.
time, he and his wife. And his relatives were buried on Hog Island. There was an indigenous burial ground there.
I was going to ask you about that. I'd seen some references to that. I think on the western edge of Hog Island.
Actually, it's where the Crane family is buried.
Oh, up on the hill, on the
Yeah,
summit.
yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Okay.
Over more than 10, maybe 10, over maybe 12 skeletons were removed from that site at some point in the past. The bones were brought to Harvard University for forensic analysis, and who knows what happened with the grave goods,
Oh,
but those graves were removed. And I was just thinking about this and wondering if I could quickly find what the date was, but I didn't run across it. I'm sure it was well before the Cranes had anything to do with it, but
yeah.
you know,
Oh,
and that's a very common thing. I mean, there was everywhere where there were burial grounds. It was a thing in the late 1800s to dig them up, to get the grave goods to put in the museums, and to take away the bones so that they could develop there.
so the idea was that in order to develop the land, they ought to or had to remove the bones from the Native American burial grounds.
I think it's not it wasn't a policy. It was that if you happen to come across a burial, it then became a thing to dig everything up.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And so no one knows exactly for sure what happened.
To Masconomet?
Or no, to at the burial site, his
Oh,
relatives who were buried there. We know that they were removed. And did you say they were taken to
ever since the law that was passed, that's referred to as NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which I think was 1990 something. So museums have had to return human material and grave goods that were taken from indigenous burial grounds. And that's still an ongoing process. That's still
okay.
And has been very upsetting to a lot of people on both sides.
I can imagine.
Yeah, very, very upsetting.
Yeah.
And it's often very difficult to figure out what might have been a grave good as opposed to a secular object.
Yeah.
And also in Massachusetts, there is really only one federally recognized group, which is the Wampanoag. There are two or three different branches of the Wampanoag, but it's the Wampanoag people, and the other people are not particularly represented. There were, the Nipmuc and the Pawtucket and the Pentucket and the Pecumtuck, and other people.
Yeah.
So everything has to be taken in by the Wampanoag and reburied in consecrated ground, sort of at intertribal cemeteries and so on.
Yeah.
But a great deal of the material is just lost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Destroyed or lost.
Well, I would like to find out from you what happened to Masconomet, but before we talk about that, I'm curious, could you talk about, of course, we talk about Choate Island today. People from Ipswich still will refer to it as Hog Island. And could you tell us why it came to be known as Hog Island?
I believe it's because it was used to confine herds of swine, or the swine herd. And the problem was that the Mass Bay Colony General Court was having to compensate the Indians for damage to their crops that were being caused by the pigs. The pigs would root up the clam flats, and they would root out the garbage. They would get into the corn. And so there were two movements there. One was to make the Indians put fences around their cornfields to keep pigs out. It's a little tricky. I mean, fences keep out large animals, but pigs can dig under things.
Yeah.
So it didn't really work. And so the solution became you either had to ring your hogs so that they couldn't root, or you had to confine them. There are hog islands all up and down the coast. There's also Cow Island, Milk Island, Ram Island, there are pound islands where animals were impounded, like 10-pound island or 5-pound island in Gloucester. They were places where a certain number of animals of a certain species could be confined to segregate them. So,
I love that story.
well, there are hog islands all up and down the coast.
And I just think people should know that history.
Yeah.
Because it's just a great story.
Well, that was one of the things that impressed me was the efforts that the colonial government went to at first to try to do things right and make things fair. And if you look at the court records, you can see that in the first generation, there really was an effort to apply law equally for both colonists and indigenous people. But after the so-called Great Migration, where you have 20,000 more people or 50,000, however many it was, it just became impossible to do that.
And in part, Marielle, I mean, you mentioned the first epidemic coming in 1633, and my understanding is that then indigenous populations just were decimated pretty much after that, without any natural, immunity. to the illnesses that the Europeans had brought. Is that
True,
accurate?
but just like with all our other endemic diseases, people acquire immunity if they survive, and
Yeah.
those populations were beginning to recover.
Mm.
But one of the misconceptions that has been carried down through the ages is that, oh, the Indians sort of became extinct or they died out. And you read Governor Winthrop's account of the people in Plymouth and Tisquantum or Squanto discovering that all his people had died at Pawtucket and so on, that he was the sole survivor or whatever. These stories have become expanded and applied universally, but
Ah,
there was actually a lot of variation in the impacts of these diseases and who they affected and when. The smallpox epidemics did not upset people in the upper Merrimack Valley until around 1736,
mm,
100 years later. Um, and As I say, there were people that were acquiring immunity because these are recurring diseases. It's just like
mhm.
how COVID doesn't kill so many people now. You know,
Yeah, but it's still
uh,
out there.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's there and it's recurrent. It's like
yeah.
when influenza was initially a killer. Now we just have outbreaks every year, and there's all manner of different levels of acquired immunity, so that not so many people die
Mm,
of it. So it was the same thing with that type of disease as well. And the people who were inland were not as affected as the people on the coast. The
mhm.
people in the north, on the North Shore and northern, were not as affected as people in the south of the Charles watershed. So, yeah.
Well, that's really interesting and an important distinction to make. And it reminds me of, learning from you about all the different kind of indigenous groups makes clear the limitations of how American history is taught. Whereas it's very binary and very simplified, way oversimplified, leaves out a
Right.
lot of detail and a lot of people because it's presented as,
Real
you
history is
know,
hard.
well, it's like there were the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, and that's it.
Yeah.
And it's so much more complex and fascinating because people are people, whenever they live. And of course, people have intrigues, people have alliances, and the alliances shift around. And that's what I love about talking to you, is because it's clear that there were all these different alliances. And as you're pointing out now, some groups were very much affected by the illnesses that the Europeans brought, but not everybody, and not everybody at the same time. And some people became immune, and so it's a much more complex and therefore interesting and nuanced kind of picture of United States history.
Yeah.
And so I'm really glad you're writing your book. No pressure. But let's go back to, so what happened to Masconomet?
Okay, well, he was a very respected ruler. He was a subordinate Sagamore. He was not a Sockham. Um, and he was involved in marriages of alliance of his children to other groups, to both the Pennacook and to the Massachusetts. Um, and and that was a pattern in New England for them to have these marriages of alliance, which has caused people to not know, well, who were they? Were they Nipmuc? Were they Massachusetts? Were they, Abenaki, which is what Danapashamet was, and so on. They were all those things through their marriages of alliance. It's like
Okay.
looking at the royal houses of Europe or something,
Oh, yes.
where there's a Dutch and there's a German and there's Italian and Spanish
Yeah.
people intermarried. So Masconomet was constantly petitioning the general court in his people's behalf to be allowed to have guns,
Mhm.
to be granted powder and shot, so that they could use them. And they were able to keep their guns. There was one brief period where they were disarmed over a rumor that there was going to be an uprising. But
Oh,
otherwise, they were able to keep their guns even throughout the King Philip's War, the so-called Wampanoag War, it actually turns out to have been a war that Plymouth Colony started for the purpose of getting Wampanoag land. But history has it that it was the Indians rising up against the colonists. So another one of those little historical reversals there. Don't get me started on that.
You can come back.
Yeah. And Masconomet, from time to time, is making him a nuisance of himself in the court. But they were very clever about using the English court system and English laws to further their own interests, and they were very smart about that. And very smart about learning how to properly do deeds so that they could preserve rights for themselves. In 1644, Masconomet and a bunch of others went to the court in Salem to swear allegiance to the English. And they took an oath that they would be loyal to the English, that they would remain neutral in any conflict, that they would convert to Christianity, that they would allow their children to be instructed in Christianity, and that they would, make every effort to assimilate that they could. And this included, there were a whole lot of them were there. The Sonk Squaw, the so-called Squaw Sachem Nanapashamet's widow, was there with her sons, and Passaconaway and his son signed that agreement. Cuchamacan and Chickatawbut's nephew from Massachusetts, they came and signed it. So it was a very broadly endorsed article. And this was in the expectation that they were, in exchange for this, that their loyalty and so on and so forth, they were going to receive equal protection under English law. This was the whole thing, and defense against their enemies. And they didn't, I don't think, realize at the time what they were giving up, because the very next year, the English made powwows illegal. And the year after that, Indians could be taken into service against their will, and they could be enslaved for residedness, and it just sort of started to go down the hill after that. But Masconomet was very active in trying to sustain rights for the people. And Essex County did protect its indigenous people for as long as it could, right up until the 1690s, or the 1680s, I should say. And then it just absolutely became impossible to be identified as a Native American in New England. That was the end. So there were efforts made, and but there was also just tremendous exploitation in order to acquire the land. The whole thing right there. It did not become a racialized thing until later. It wasn't hatred of Indians as a race in the beginning at all. It just had to do with the fact that they were impeding the agricultural ambitions of the colonists. That was the whole thing. And much later, it becomes a racialized issue. And Masconomet gave his children Christian names, and his descendants are alive today with Christian names. They're many of them are living on Martha's Vineyard. All of the main lineages of the 17th century have living descendants today. They're either completely assimilated, or they're in indigenous communities all throughout New England, because there was this huge diaspora.
That's exactly the word I was going to use, a diaspora. But I believe Masconomet is he's buried. Is it Sagamore Hill? I think.
Right. He and his wife and several others are buried up there on Sagamore Hill, and he died in 1658.
Well, Mary Ellen, gosh, this has just been fascinating. I could go on and ask you more and more, but I'm going to give you a break. One of the things I planned to ask you as he ended was about the biggest misconceptions about, that non-Indigenous people have, but you've already talked about so many of them. And I think that just merits another interview, another time. We'll give you a break. But it's just been fascinating to learn from you. And I so appreciate the work that you've done.
Thank you.
To study this history, which is so complex and so fascinating.
It is. I'm learning new things all the time.
It is the farthest thing in the world from, there was Plymouth Rock and some Native Americans, they had Thanksgiving together, I mean, it's so much deeper and broader and revelatory about, just how people behave, when there's colonization, then there's immigrants and conditions change and dependencies change, and those alliances change. And so it's just really, really a fascinating portrait, not just of the indigenous history of Essex County, but of the history of humans and human nature and how people interact and how power is exchanged and resources are exchanged. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah.
Thank you. It's just been delightful to talk to you. I really, it's precious, Mary Ellen, the work that you do. And for anybody who wants to read more of Mary Ellen's history, you can find some of her essays on local Indigenous history on several websites. I'll tell you what they are right now: historicipswich.org, capeandhistory.org, enduringgloucester.com, and a really fascinating website, capeandslavery.org. All of those are places where you can find writings by Mary Ellen Lepionka. Mary Ellen, thank you so much. It's just been a joy and a pleasure, and I've learned so much from you. I really appreciate, as I said, the work you do, and you're taking time to be with us today. And you haven't heard the last from me.
Thank you, Mary. It's been wonderful to talk with you this morning.
Thank you. So, all right, that's it for today, everybody. Thank you for watching and listening. Please join us next Thursday at 9 for the morning show.